a lot of people whose roles means that they wear many hats in small think tanks. So I'm an independent design strategist and social designer. And what that means is I work with organisations to help them understand the challenges that they face. They collectively reframe the problems and to find innovative ways forward. And that might mean that it's overarching strategic approach in how they deliver outcomes or how they seek to deliver services that they provide to citizens, business or funding models, programs and social interventions that can enhance the effectiveness or create a pointed impact into an issue that they're looking at. And more often than not, it's looking at the organisational change and the capability required to deliver those outcomes. So my specialty is helping other experts unlock their knowledge collectively and working with multiple stakeholders across social issues. And so for that, what that means is I use design as my predominant discipline and methodology in both approach and the tools I use. But I draw on many disciplines in working to seek innovative ways forward and ultimately believe in a transdisciplinary way of working to see collective intelligence in that. So enough about me. Let's move on to the agenda today and some housekeeping. So today we're going to be taking an intro to events within the think tank world, and through the lens of design. My colleagues and think tanks and friends of on think tanks who contribute on think tanks have written other pieces on this topic. So please feel free to take a look at their website to get other really interesting points of view. Our agenda is as follows. So we're going to be talking about why events as a channel in the think tank context. We're going to be talking about the think tank context itself and what challenges and opportunities that might bring up. We're going to briefly touch around what is design and what is human-centered design. We're going to talk about the architecture of events. We're going to be talking about purpose of events and how do you measure and evaluate success in that. And then we're going to have a small reflection and a quick moment to stop and take stock. And then we're going to look at some design tools. Now that will be around the idea of personas, which I will explain later, of empathy mapping, a tool I like to use called the 5 E's, and experience mapping. And then finally, last but not least, I will be talking around the principles and the pitfalls for designing events in this space. Now, the idea is that it will inspire you and will create awareness in regards to the use of those tools. And I don't expect that you're going to be able to go away and use them in its entirety, but you'll get some understanding and sense of how to use them. And then, of course, that we can continue that conversation further and you can continue to look into how you might use those tools. But certainly you'll be able to go away and have a go at them afterwards. Some housekeeping. We have a number of people on the line today, and at the end of each section I will stop for questions and clarifications. And you can ask questions via the chat function I think it's at the top of your screen, and you can write in. You can write a direct message to on think tanks if you're having some sort of issue. Otherwise, I will endeavour to sort of summarise based on the themes and answer appropriately. However, if there's a really big question that comes up, I will put that to the side and collate those, and if it deserves a response afterwards, then I will send a group email with a response to that. So please don't be offended if I am unable to answer your question specifically. Okie dokie. So let's move into why events. So events are a solid fixture as a channel for communication in the think tank world. And we use the event format to serve a variety of needs, whether it might be to present back findings after the conclusion of a project, to launch a report or a book, to spark debate on a topic for which we might, of course, have policy recommendations, or often have a chance to utilize the timely arrival of a prominent academic. And so therefore this means that we can be strategic in the use of events, somewhat opportunistic, and sometimes I would argue potentially lacking purpose or direction. So my view on this topic generally is that events are no longer one-way broadcasts. They are opportunities for open dialogue, and they can harness collective intelligence, create moments that matter, and really act as a catalyst for action long after the lights have gone out. And so what it means is that the event experience doesn't end once everyone's left, and how do you cultivate that action and those relationships afterwards? Events give us a chance to participate in a really tactile human way that a report or an email or a briefing just can't provide. And they provide a relational experience and a chance to make personal connections, a face to a name, and to communicate with body language. And so events tap into all of our senses, and there's a spatiality and a 360 experience to that. And we do all of this through the orchestration and sequencing of moments that matter. And so, like movies where potentially a plot artifact, such as the loss of some secret documents at the beginning of a Mission Impossible movie, means that the event can be more than just that moment. It can be that item that and that catalyst and that vehicle that drags you through that story and allows new relationships to unfold, organisations to meet, to inspire action, to create new knowledge, to test ideas, and of course, while we're all probably here, to advocate and influence on topics that we hold important. And of course, storytelling is inherent in our DNA, and it's we know it's the way Aboriginal communities have handed down knowledge for thousands of years, and it helps us communicate complex ideas and to connect to human emotion. And what it makes for people is that abstract concepts become relatable to a person and their emotions, and therefore it enhances our ability to process information and retain information and relate to it on a much more personal level. So my friends in branding and communications, who I'm sure some of them are online, hi, talk about storytelling, and absolutely rightly so. But often I find that the telling aspect of that means, too often than not, storytelling is not participatory. It is a one-way broadcast situation in a lot of instances. And why is that important? Well, we'll talk about that further later. But I find that stories are often positioned in the past. And so what I want to talk about today in terms of event experiences is utilising storytelling, but going from simple storytelling to really immersive experiences and capturing the value of that for your organisation and for your audience and for your mission. And what an event does, it can utilise good aspects of storytelling and move into crafting those experiences that are multidimensional. And create first-person memories for people, which is really important. And so I wanted to ask you today, are you orchestrating moments that matter in your events? Whether you have a panel event, a conference, a debate, consider this question. I've got someone asking me, a question there. Are you able to support people in those moments that matter, and how will your event support those themselves? So I wanted you to just maybe take 30 seconds to reflect on that in your own work and what you do within your think tank, and consider that for a moment before we move on. Okay, so the think tank context itself. We've discussed that there are differing reasons for holding an event in the think tank context, whether it might be to garner new information, whether it be to influence, to advocate, to express a point of view, to find fundraising or raise brand awareness and your brand value. And there's an aspect of status in that, particularly when you have academics. So there's a thought leadership perspective to that. And of course, you want to be able to demonstrate outcomes, not only to your funders, to your stakeholders, but the wider system that you speak to. But of course, some of the barriers that we all find is that budgets are low. People are often time poor in think tanks. They're stretched and are wearing many different hats. And I think a lot of the time, the audience is actually of a high quality. So I'd like to stop here for a moment and maybe open up for questions and ask, what are the barriers that you find in the think tank context for events? So you can ask questions via the chat function above. I'm just going to move over to that. I can see some people here. Enrique, what do you think are the barriers? Yeah, okay, so often an expectation of what an event should look like. Could you explain that more? What is that? Is that an opportunity or potentially a barrier itself? I'm back. Hello. Look, I'm back. I apologise. I don't know why it's doing that. I'm sorry. Okay, can everyone hear me? I think someone's off mute. If everyone can mute their microphones, that would be great, please. Okay, so we're going to talk about what is design. So for those of you who saw me at the conference, we spoke about design in terms of not creating solutions in the same sense that we create solutions to mathematical equations or absolute truths in an abstract world. Designers create proposed solutions to be judged on a sliding scale for better or worse to the needs of their stakeholders. And what that means in terms of what design is it cuts across all human activities as a particular concept in how we address physical, commercial, social, and public outcomes. And of course, as a lot of you know, it's historically linked to industrialization and consumption, and takes a concrete form in how human needs are met through particular planning disciplines, whether it be product design, architecture, graphic design, or otherwise. However, we also then are aware of design thinking, and that means it's the application of how designers think to problem solving. Could the person who doesn't have their microphone muted, please mute it on Think Tanks? Maybe you could. So it's a plan for achieving change. It's a practice with a set of approaches, methods, tools, and processes for creating these plans. And it's also a way of reasoning for guiding these processes. And I think what the benefit is it can complement your current communication methods, assist in problem solving, help you design particular responses, and it can also create efficiencies, help you understand a particular context, and it's also future forward looking, which I think is an important thing to note. So if we move on to the next slide. So human-centered design is potentially a term that you've come across at some point. And what that means in the sense is that it's a design-led approach to problem solving that puts the human at the center. So it starts with the people and their needs, not the organizational process or the organizational needs. And so that means that we optimize the design, and that might be the event experience, the service, the product, the program, or the organization itself, around what those group of people need, what they want, and what their behaviors are in how they experience a product, service, experience, or indeed so intervention as such. And again, as I said, it's that outside in versus inside out. We are designing not around our own organizational processes and our own needs, or our clunky tech system, or our compliance requirements, but actually considering how those people might lead how we respond to them as an organization. And it's about not only how you think, but what you do. And I think what it means is it's useful in the way that once you understand people that you're trying to design for from their point of view, and you empathize with them through research and through deeper understanding, you're more likely to create more innovative solutions, sustainable solutions, and more tailored solutions to them, so they can be more efficient as well. And it can bring disparate bodies of knowledge together. And what I often find is design is a useful language to synthesize other disciplines when you're working in a multidisciplinary approach. It's a very useful tool in that instance. Okay, so for those who have not seen a design thinking process, this is one example. There's many. This is a very simplified one, potentially not one I use directly, but it's based on the same principles. So you will see there are a number of different stages, and so we will empathize with the people that we are designing for, and we will understand them in a deep way through user research. We will define what the problem is, and often the problem that's presented to you is potentially not the problem that you need to solve. And so it's about once understanding those people and the behaviors and the context, is being able to redefine and reframe what that problem is. And then, of course, we move into ideation stage, so coming up with solutions, and we prototype those. And that's different to piloting. Prototyping can be a very simple exercise, and it's an iterative exercise where it's a constantly learning exercise. So we're testing those, we're measuring that, and then we might go around implementing a pilot or before further scaling and rolling out. And so I'm going to stop here for those who I've completely confused potentially at this point around what is design. I think this is a really useful way of describing it. Design exists in layers. And so if we look on the left-hand side of the screen, we will see the concrete and complicated, right up through to the complex and abstract. And so we'll see signs and symbols and graphics and communication design at the bottom of this. It's a concrete situation. Then we move up to objects and product design, and we see how people interact and behave. And then, of course, the third layer, which we're talking about today, is experiences. And that also takes form in how we deliver our services, whether it's in a think tank, and you can see some of my thoughts of think tanks and services on their website. How people experience customer experiences, how people experience user interfaces and technology. And then, of course, we move into systems design, which is often where I like to sit, which is around policies, multi-stakeholder mission approaches to particular issues, and organisational culture. And so I have a little exercise for you right now, which was initially designed by Tom, whose surname I'm sorry I can't pronounce, but it's around drawing toast. Now, I did this in Japan a couple of years ago, and I got completely blank stares. So I hope at the very least there is something accessible to this to the audience members at the moment. So for those of you who I'm getting someone chat. Okay. So I wanted you to think about, just for a moment, a process diagram, essentially. Scribble it on the back of your notepad. But think about how you would go about making toast, whether it would be pulling out the bread, getting the butter, putting it in the toaster. And just spend a minute thinking about sketching that out. What are the activities? So you can start now. What are the activities that you need to go through? What steps do you need to go through? What's the sequence that you need to go through to do that? Whether it is the farm, right back through to the farming stage, or is it going to your cupboard and pulling out bread? Whatever stage you might be, think about just some of the sequencing of what that is. What are the actions? And what this means is you are visualizing something, and it can help introduce visual thinking, and it can help you understand mental models, and it can help you understand sequencing and timelines. And I think this is really appropriate to designing event experiences, is to think about that simple task itself and have a go at it. So I'm going to mute myself for a moment, and if anyone wants to hold up their scribble, don't be ashamed. It can be definitely scribble, and hold it up to the screen. We'd love to see. Can you hear me? Yes, yes. So I was going to pick on someone. I was going to pick on maybe Diana that I know that's on here, Joseph that I know on here. If anyone wants to share their screen, whether it's some quick scribbles, or if you'd like to share some comments on the chat now about what you thought about that, please do. I think it's a really useful task to be able to think through how you might experience something and the actions that you undertake. Is anyone brave enough to share? Come on, I know someone can. Hey, there we go. Look at that. Sophia, nice, nice. Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for participating. I like that. Anyone else? All right, well, we'll move on. Have another go at that after the event, if you like. And what I think is actually useful when I do this within groups is what you'll find is no two are the same. Everyone experiences that differently. Everyone frames that differently. And when you think about what you needed in that experience, whether you needed to know how to use a toaster, or you needed fire, whatever it might be in your situation, everyone is different. And so I think it's a really great exercise to try, and maybe try it with a colleague at some point. So we will move on. So there's some examples. You can see everyone has drawn it differently, and some very nice scribbles there. So wrapping up on some of the design aspects before we move on to more of the context around think tanks. I wanted to pull out some principles around how designers behave or interact in this space. So we focus on human values, and we have, as I've said before, you have empathy for the people you are designing for, and you really understand what their needs and desires and their motivations are, and so you walk in their shoes. And designers craft clarity, just as the very simple visual exercise that we've just undertaken can vaguely demonstrate. We try to understand a problem, and we try to understand a problem from different perspectives and synthesize that, and help able to frame problems how they're currently framed, and collectively reframe a problem so that you can find new and innovative ways forward in what you do. Designers embrace experimentation, and so prototyping not only to validate an idea and but to build, to think, and to learn. And so I encourage you to try and do this rather than moving through to potentially pilot stages in either your programs or your experiences. Consider how that might feel, whether it might be acting it out or making a simple model or scribbling and using some paper and just working out loud and working through that. I think it's a really useful tool. And we embrace serious play. You can see someone there rehearsing a situation, and what that means is that you can consider different points of view, and what you'll find is insights often come out in those situations because you'll realise that there's a need unanswered, or there's something that you've not addressed in that situation. And we celebrate diversity and collaboration. And it brings people together with different points of view to create breakthroughs. And I think designing in silos, whether it's your event experience or a conference, means that if you're designing by yourself, that you won't get the richest picture of how to produce the success and the outcomes that you want to create. And we show, not tell. So being able to communicate your vision in meaningful ways using visuals or to tell stories. And we will talk about that in some of the design tools coming up. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. And rinse and repeat. So it's an iterative process. It's about constantly learning and considering your feedback, testing it, and iterating that design further and learning. Or sometimes, in some instances, completely throwing that out the window. And whilst you might prove your hypotheses wrong, you would have learned something and be able to start again, which is often, I find, a risk management approach when you are designing either programs or services for other people. And it means that you're often in quite ambiguous situations, and being able to be okay with that and address that and know that at certain points within a design process, it is quite ambiguous. Okay, so that finishes the sort of design overall perspective. So we're going to move much more back into the context of events, specifically in the think tank event experience. Is there any questions on some of that before I move on? If anyone has any questions, please use the chat function at the top. Oh, I'm sorry, it's saying that the sound is not good. Okay, 1 second. How's that? Sophia, is that good? Excellent, okay. I felt like I solved a problem there. Good. Okay, so moving on, unless there's any particular questions about design, that was a very quick fly through and a very big topic. But let's move on to some more contextual issues around why you're here. So, what makes up event? What's the architecture of events? So in my mind, there is an aspect around purpose. Why are you having that event? What are you hoping to try and achieve? Why have an event in the first place? And certainly that's a question that I think you should be all asking in your think tanks. Is this the right channel to communicate what you're and achieve what you're trying to achieve? And if it's not, then maybe consider other channels, or at least compare and contrast how you might achieve this in other ways. And sometimes that means it's a multi-layered approach in your strategy. It has a narrative. It has a clear narrative from beginning to end around your messaging and what type of points you're trying to communicate. People, of course, something that some people forget, and certainly as we were discussing before, people considering how the speakers are the most important people there. But of course, you have an amazing audience who have given up their time and absolutely need to value who those people are and the differences in what they might need. Place. Now, I've separated that out to environment because place, what I mean is sort of venue and location. And then time. So pacing, momentum, and staging. How will you pace the event? How do you create momentum from different stages? And I think this is particularly useful in conferences. How do you move from a highly intense sort of segment in your conference to the next segment? And how will those different pacing and those needs affect your audience? The environment. So when I say environment, I mean sort of everything that you feel and touch and surround you with. So often a place or a venue is a box, but consider what goes in the box and how will that guide the behavior of people. If you put all the chairs up the front and no one can get through to sit down, then that creates a problem. But of course, then in much more bigger complex situations, the environment becomes even more important. Knowledge. How will you share knowledge and how will you create knowledge and how will you support dialogue
within your events. And so therefore, how will you create those moments that matter? And that doesn't mean in a false sense. It means around creating a supporting structure for those things to happen, for knowledge share, for relationships, to face-to-face meetings. And I think for those who went to the On Think Tanks conference recently, there was a lot of those moments that you were able to stop and have a really genuine and deep conversation. And what they did was they structured their event timing and their process to allow for those moments to occur. And so that's what I mean by moments that matter. Being able to have a supporting structure and a process and a pacing that supports those moments. Does anyone have any comments or questions before we move on to the next stage? Okay, so strategy and measurement and evaluation. So creating strategic events. And I wanted to stop here to think about, how is your event connected to your organizational goal and your mission? And do you know that? Are you privy to that information? Is it clear? Is it written down somewhere? Do you know where your organization is going? And what is your yearly plan? A lot of the strategic plans that I've seen will have a couple of themes that they're really going to be focusing on for the year. So is this event directly connected to one of those and helping you achieve that particular theme, or does it sit within that theme, and how will it feed back up into your organization's broader goals and objectives? But then we move back down the scale a little bit. What is the purpose of the event? Can you articulate a goal? Is it clear and concise, and is it connected up to those other things that we've just spoken about? And often you'll find in think tanks we might have a series of events situated around a particular theme. So considering how each of those sub-events might feed and what's the purpose of those, and how are they interconnected to feed back up into the wider purpose, and then how does that feed back up into your organizational goals or your plan for the year? Outcomes. What is the expected result? I think this is something that not a lot of people put some effort into. What do you expect out of this event? What do you hope to achieve? And how objectives, how will you achieve the goal? So if your goal, or one of your goals, is the quality of debate, simply articulating that is great, and gold star for that. But what will you do? How will you support quality of debate through your event design? And then, of course, something that all think tank people love is, how will you measure success? It's a very difficult thing, no doubt. And I think a lot of measurement metrics can be misleading or fake, particularly if you're sort of considering how many likes you've got on Facebook or whatever. So considering how you will measure success, which we will go into in a moment. But a question that I often ask, particularly if you're the communications person then hosting or organizing the event for your wider organization, asking your key stakeholders personally, themselves, what will success look like and what will it feel like? And I think this is a really useful question to be asking people. And I often will do this to all of my stakeholders, either publicly or behind the scenes. Because I think it's really useful to uncover some of the potential politics in the situation, the particular agendas in the situation, given the context we're working in. And it allows them, the stakeholders, to articulate that in a different way, rather than sort of dry measurement metrics that often sit on a Word document. So your event must have a core argument. being able to articulate that core argument, and a narrative, a thread throughout your event that then feeds into that core argument. Now, that doesn't mean that all of your speakers, and I certainly hope they don't, they're not going to all agree on that argument, but what is the argument that is going to be presented? Simply having a title and a theme is not enough. So I think being able to articulate that up front will help you plan your event far more effectively and successfully, and it means that you have reached a consensus before you get too far down the line and find out that potentially what the event style is that you've created is not suitable for the argument and the objectives that you're trying to achieve. Articulate your top line messaging. What is the one thing you want people to know after this event? Write it down, share it with people, test it with people. And then something that I always ask people to do is, what are the 3 things that you want them to remember after the event? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean just your messaging, but it might be that they want to remember that your organisation was really friendly, really articulate, and you want them to remember one particular point of view. But whatever it might be, think about the 3 things that you want them to remember when they go away. Does anyone have any questions before I move on to measuring success in this space? There's a lot of information on that page. Okay. So what is success? Now, I sat down to write this out and decided that my wonderful colleague Caroline had done it for me and potentially articulated it better than me. So I've pinched hers. You can see her article link down the bottom. We come at it from the same perspective. So you can see how she's discussed it in the article below. But what we talked about is having those key objectives and understanding how your purpose for your event will feed up into your strategic goal for your think tank or your plan for your think tank across that particular year. So there are a number of things that you might be hoping to achieve with your event, whether it be your workshop or a closed round table or a conference or the launch of a report. So here is a list of some things. So I'll just very quickly go over them. So to the degree which an event stimulates debate and new thinking, does it increase knowledge in that space? How will it influence the wider debate? How does it contribute to convening and networking? How will it raise awareness? Oh, thank you, Enrique. Thank you. That's great. The inclusiveness of the participation, the timing of the event, as in the wider context, whether it might be the political context of the situation, the reach of any message, and whether it generates practical advice or feedback. Now, these go back to some of the principles that I spoke about at the beginning in regards to creating open dialogue, to convening networks, to having a knowledge share and open events. But these are quite elusive things to measure, right? So what Caroline discusses in this is, and it's a draft format that she's testing at the moment, so feel free to build on that and share with us at On Think Tanks. Consider out of this list or a list of your own, what are the few things that you're really trying to achieve in this space, and what does good look like and what does bad look like? So create a sentence for each of those, and then ascribe a value to those, whether it's sort of 1 to 5, and being able to use that as a framework across your events portfolio across the year, so that you have some sort of baseline measurement for your events. So a consistency in the way that you measure success. And making sure that you learn from this and you iterate your style. So if you come back and you find that a workshop didn't work for a particular group of people, you can consider why not. You can change your tactics for that, and you can reach them in a new way whether it's through the communication channel of events or in another instance. So I think it's a really great way to achieve success. It's not a hugely scientific way. I respect that, and I'm sure all of your evidence advocates out there might find that a little fluffy, but I think it's very useful. And of course, there are other much more sort of social media metrics and communication metrics that we currently use. Impressions, and you can use anecdotal feedback. You can create vox pops and interview people throughout your conference. You can have surveys afterwards, but what it is around being able to draw on all that knowledge and collate it and use that to move forward and learn from. Does anyone have anything that they'd like to share at this point, or questions on that? No? Okay. Okay. So, I hope everyone's feeling okay, and if you need a drink or anything, make sure you have one. We're going to move into useful tools. Now, as I mentioned before, design is complementary to the things that you're already doing. So it's not about throwing away your current approaches to communicating in the think tank context. It's merely something that we offer up as complementary approach to something, and test and combine those ideas. Now, some of these tools are quite simple, and I think that's the beauty of them, but also sometimes, whether it's a very simple round table, there might be a depth in which you use these tools. So you can use them in a light way, and you can use them in a much more deeper, researched, informed and heavy way. And certainly, some of the tools that we use take some time to collate the research and use it effectively. But at the very least, I think using it in a light touch will add value immediately to what you do. So we're going to be talking about understanding your audience. Now, I know that there are a number of different articles on think tanks that talk to this point, and again, this is building upon that existing knowledge and not putting that to one side. It's just purely coming at it from a design lens and an introductory design lens to it. So personas, those of you in communications are probably well versed in this specifically, but personas are fictitious redactions of real audiences. And I'm going to use the word audiences, customers, or people because of the context it changes, I guess. And some people don't like customers, which is I totally take on board. So they are used to keep the audience reality and your preferences during the development process to the front of mind. And they are used as a set to demonstrate similarities, their needs and their behaviors. And it's something that you can share as a principle for who are you designing with. Because as we know, the audience is not one homogenous group of people, and certainly at the bigger events you might have a couple of really strategic groups of people you want to be talking to. So understanding how you will answer those needs to those different audience groups I think is useful, in being able to draw that out. So personas as a fictitious sort of character is intended to communicate characteristics and expectations, such as their preferred communication methods. They create a unified view of who is the target and their needs. So you're collating different points of research in to create this sort of audience section. It provides a single source of truth against which decisions can be validated. within your organization. And it can model sort of behaviors based on the validated information, how someone might interact, what are their preferences, what will they do, how will you spark that group of people to take action after your event. What is it that you really need to drill into around their particular behaviors and their values that's going to mean that they're going to come back to you after the event and, you know, fund you or create some sort of joint venture or enhance a particular project through their knowledge and their collaboration. It can create a common language when thinking about your audience and your customer or your customer. And it provides a basis for innovation and brainstorming different ideas. So it can be a very simple tool. It can be some pieces of paper, which I will show you next. And it can be used sitting around a boardroom table saying, is this event going to answer these 3 different groups of people's needs? And if not, why not? And do we need to split this out? Is this the right style of event for these people? How is this going to work back into our purpose and our objectives? So I have an example here for you. This is just a basic example. There's lots of different variations, so feel free to do some research, and I will send you a link of a particular useful book that might cover some of these tools. But generally, it might have a sector or an area that they come from. You name them and give them a fictitious character so that when designing, they are front of mind. It will have demographics, but it is not only about demographics. It will have their needs. It will have what are their common behaviours, what do they want to know, which I think is really important in this context. What are those different things that people are coming to your event, and what do they need to know, and how will you answer those? What are they not interested in? Certainly something to consider as well. And what are their bigger goals, whether it's the organisation that you've invited, what are they trying to achieve, and how will this event feed into that? So you can see an example of a template. It's a very simple tool, but what you can do is you can add research from your social media listening, from your surveys, from semi-structured interviews, if you go out and do user research, if that's something of interest. But I suspect that you do have some data on the people that you're speaking to already, and it's about collating those into these personas. So you might have anywhere from sort of 3 to 5 different personas that you are speaking to as an organisation across the year in your event program. Does anyone have any questions on that? Okay, and we'll move on. I don't want to go too fast, so if it's too fast, let me know and I will repeat or slow down or go back to something that's required. Thank you. Yes, so someone was just saying around you can use these personas to practice speeches. I think it's useful in many different aspects of event planning, particularly when you're thinking about the argument and how this might feed into their needs and what they're there for. Why are they there and why are they coming? And then ultimately you can achieve what you're trying to achieve by addressing those as well. And I wanted to stay here because usually academics come up with me with pointed questions around this point. It can be quick and dirty, and quick and dirty can give you insights that are enough to move forward with some sort of understanding. Asking 5 people, no, that's not going to do it for you. But your own insights into the audience, and then the combination of different data points that you might have whether it's some interviews that you conduct, whether it's some of the observations you have, the data sources from your social media, combining all of those things, and potentially some of the feedback that you've already got around their likes and dislikes and their behaviours from previous events can actually be very quickly aggregated into some of these personas. And one thing I would say is share them with other people. Don't do it on your own, and don't do it by yourself, because you need to be able to share it across your organisation and say, does this look like the people that we are talking to? Do you think this feels real? Is this how they interact? Is this how they need? And someone might say, actually, no, this group of people really need this. They seem to come to our events because of these reasons. Another one is sharing it with your actual audience members. If you're friends with or close associates with some of these people that attend your event, why not share them with them and say, does this look like a group of people that you belong to? I think it's a really good way to get some quick feedback. So yes, quick and dirty can work in this situation. Okay, so empathy mapping. Okay, so empathy mapping, there are a different couple of canvases that are available, and I can share those with you in my post email to the webinar that I will send over the next 24 hours. So there's a couple of different canvases you can use. However, there's a very basic one that I've put on there for presentation purposes to make it simple. And it can be as simple as this. So this is a map to think about those personas that we've just talked about, and taking that persona and understanding and extrapolating what they want, what they're going to think, feel, say, and do. Now, this tool is often used in a present state analysis if you're designing for a service. So you might go out and do a lot of research to understand what their emotions are in interacting with a service with you, or with your organisation as such. But what I like to use it for in events is a future state from not only our perspective as an organisation, but from their perspective. So I use it twofold. So I sit down and I think about, from our organisational perspective, and what our strategy is and what our objectives are, what do I want the audience members to think after the event? What will they value after the event? What are their thoughts? What will their emotions be after the event? Will they feel inspired? Will they feel empowered? What is it that you want them to feel after your event? And that would differ on the different type of events that you hold. What is it that you want them to say? So what is the aspirational thing that you hope them to go away from your event and say? What are those defining words that they will use? I was so interested to hear the perspective on think tanks have on this policy issue, or how they recommend to look at organisational strategy. And so thinking about what is it that you'd like them to be sort of saying, and what are the actions and behaviours you'd like them to undertake in your event. So post-event, during the event, what type of things? Do you want to spark debate? Do you want to have really meaningful debate? Do you want them to go away after the event and call you? Do you want them to email you? Do you want them to participate in your next event? So what's your sort of call to action in that space? And think about those behaviours. What behaviours will they model during the event? So I think that in this context is probably the most useful way of thinking about it in a planning perspective. But then, of course, as advocates for human-centered design, we are going back to the actual audience themselves. So using this map, think about those personas around, from their perspective, sitting in their shoes. What will they want to feel and do and think about during the event, pre, post, and after? And so you can start to understand what are their preferences around sharing information, of learning information. What do you think they will be feeling at this event? Is it excitement because a new report has come out? Or if it's a debate, are they nervous about some sort of public perception around something that you might be saying? So think about those things, and then think about how you might either mitigate some of those that might be negative, or how you might deliver on those as opportunities as well. So I wanted to stop there and just let you soak that in for a moment. Is there any questions on this mapping tool? Of course, some of this information will come from some of your research that you've already synthesized in your persona process. Right, Joseph, hi. Is this about how you want them to feel, or how you think they will feel? How you think they will feel. Okay, let me try and answer that. So as I said, I use this in two ways. I will always advocate for understanding how you think they will feel. So from their perspective, considering the event. But I also think it's a useful planning tool for yourselves in creating purposeful and strategic events. So it's twofold. One would always be audience-centered. How will those different people feel in that environment? What do they need out of that event? And what actions do you think that they want to take, or behaviours they're going to model? But then also in your planning phase. So I'm just looking, how do these insights then affect the decision making? Okay, good question. Thank you, Sophia. So let me think about that for a second. Okay. So I think, I'm trying to think of a relevant context for you. When thinking about planning your event, being clear and purposeful about what actions in the do section that you want them to take post-event, I think is a useful step. So a lot of the times people don't think about that post-event. So if you think if you're using this empathy map as a planning tool, and you want your audience members to sign up to something afterwards, what are the mechanisms that you're going to place within that event that will enhance that action or promote that action? Another example would be around perhaps you're talking to you're holding an event for new graduates or new think tankers. And so often there's a lot of inspiration in the room and there's a lot of energy in the room. So if that's the case, how will you manage that energy? How will you harness that energy in your event design? So that might be something around, okay, we know that young think tankers potentially, generalizing, are probably all going to want to have a say, and they're also going to be very eager to learn. So how do you craft moments in your event that you create a accessible moment for everyone to have their say on a topic? And then also, how can you enhance their learning and tailor the knowledge that you will be providing to those needs? So I think it's around those sort of minute decisions in, what level of information that you create. How will you craft those moments that those people need? How will you harness the energy of new think tankers in that space? Sitting them all at the all looking at the front to stage, to a big high stage with a panel and no way of interacting is probably not going to work for young think tankers. And certainly if you don't have ways in which they can interact using social media and questioning, then that's also going to be an issue. So I think, does that answer your question, Sophia? Cool. And I'm happy to talk about it offline at another point. That's fine. Try it out. I think it can be very useful in both of those situations. And it's certainly something you can do also, again, very fast. And I know I've sat with some people on think tanks to do it as well. Okay, so we're going to move on. I'm glad my internet hasn't disconnected again. So we have another one that I find useful is the 5 E's. So what is this? So it's a tool for considering the 5 stages in which someone goes through a customer experience. Now, I'm using the word customer, and I know, again, some people aren't going to be comfortable with that, and I completely understand that and probably agree with you. But I think it's a useful frame of reference here. Someone's speaking. Thanks, Enrique. Yeah, so Enrique's just put a question on there or comment on there. So tools for considering the 5 stages in which someone goes through an experience. And what it means is its value is it's a very quick prompt that can be used in meetings and plannings for your event. And it allows you to understand the particular phases and the process that occurs and the motivation, and then you can talk to the motivations and behaviors and how you're responding to those needs. So they are entice, engage, enter, engage, exit, and extend. Now, a common pitfall with designing events is most people only think about the engage section. So, and that means sort of, and potentially the enter a little bit. So what's going to happen at the event? Now, if we're talking about an event as a journey, as an end-to-end experience, this is not the full perspective of what that person will go through. And so let's move on to the next slide, and I'll explain that more. So, entice. How will our potential audience and their existing network first hear about us? What will trigger their interest? And if there's different groups of people you're trying to connect with, are there different things that will trigger them to sign up, or are there different avenues in which they will hear about you and your event and what's going to occur? So thinking about that, and of course in your communication strategy, this is something that a lot of people do. But thinking about that and reflecting back on those personas as well. If you know that there are a different type of audience, 3 or 4 different types of people come into that audience, think about how will you entice each of those? What's the hook for them that's going to make them sign up to your event specifically around what do they value and what do they need? So all of these tools then start to interlink to each other. Enter. So what impression do you create when they engage with you the first time? So that works on many different levels. If they get an email invite with spelling mistakes on it, for example, very practical, that's not potentially going to create the best impression. Or if your internet goes down on a webinar, same. Does the person at the door greet you with a smile? I have walked into my child's nursery before. No one has said hello. You don't feel welcome in that space. It's not your space. So you're a bit disorientated and therefore you don't know how to interact, and you're not comfortable, and therefore you're not creating moments in which are going to matter or create relationships. So think about who's at the door. How are they going to greet you? How will they find that room? Are they going to get lost? Are you losing potential people at your sign up because your sign up phase for your event doesn't work properly? So all of those things, and I appreciate that's on multiple levels, but think about those things. How will they what's their first impression of you as an organization? And then engage. How does this interaction play out? So this is the big section in the middle. and we have some tools post this that we will further discuss how to design your event. So thinking about what will happen in that event, what are the actions that people will undertake, what are the different moments across that journey that are going to happen in that event space at an event time, all of the things that we discussed before around environment, the pacing, the momentum, the knowledge share, the open dialogue. So what are all the things going to be supporting this as an event? What will they do? How will they feel? So looking back to your empathy map, what will they learn? All those things that we've spoken about. And then exit, another really important thing. What is the lasting impression that your audience will get in your event? Do they leave with a bad taste in the mouth because you didn't cut short your keynote speaker and now there's no time for question and answer, Q&A? Do they feel empowered or excited? Do you leave with something tangible to go away with so that they feel they've got additional value from you? And then extend. Another thing that I think a lot of people miss out on, and I know on Think Tanks have spoken about in one of their blog posts, is what happens afterwards. How will you extend that relationship? What triggers the action? Things like a post-event workshop to consider what are the big topics that happened over 3 days that potentially someone was unable to come to your event. What will trigger those actions? Will you send them a reminder? Will you send them an email with some other information and tools post-event? How will you follow up on those news relationships? And what's the word of mouth that will occur after this? What will people say after your event? And how will they interact with us in the future? I think there's a really missed opportunity, particularly in these type of events, that you have such a brain's trust in the room. And if you have a speaker-led perspective of your event rather than an audience-led perspective of your event, you potentially forget of all the knowledge that you have in the room. So how will you cultivate relationships post-event? Is it a matter of a community of practice after the event? You know, if you go away from your conference, for example, with 100 new people on your database, leaving them on your database for the next year to send out another invite is a completely missed opportunity. And so what tools of communication can you use to continue that relationship across the year or between events? And how will you harness their knowledge with all these amazing people in the room? So thinking about all of those things as particular phases across your event from an end-to-end experience, not just the bit in the middle, is a really useful way of prompting you to consider what you will do at all of those stages. So it's a planning tool, and I think it's a very useful one. Does anyone have any comments or concerns or questions that they want to talk about at this point? Does the word customer include both speakers and audience? I love that question. That's an awesome question. Okay. Yes. I think yes is the answer. It absolutely does, because I guess the difference between, and we're just going back a step, the difference between a terminology user-centered design versus human-centered design, if people have come up against those words, or customer-centered design, I think you need to understand all of the parties' needs within that space. So understanding what the speaker needs are and what your audience needs are both required. However, I would still then advocate that your event needs to be designed around your audience. without ignoring the needs of your speakers. So if you're going to not give them any water and not keep them informed and not communicate with them prior to the event and not send them the information that they need, then absolutely you're not doing your job. But when you're talking about sort of the event experience as a whole, it should be audience or customer led. Does that answer your question? Okay, cool. Okay, so there's a question here. It says, how can we ensure people are engaged for an event of 200 people, for example? Any suggestions on how to keep personas engaged, e.g. avoid being on the phones and the computers? How do we keep sessions interesting and engaging? Formats other than the usual panels. And entice. Any suggestions on how to entice policymakers to events? Are there any mechanisms that you've used before that would be proven to work? Okay, there's quite a a few questions in that. Some of that I might take off into, as I said, the email, post webinar email. Yes, I think just in regards to, yeah, so I can answer that in more detail for you in the post-event email. But yes, how do you ensure that people are engaged across a 200 people event, and how do you keep them engaged at multiple times? So we're going to move on to another tool that might be useful. But I think it's around considering all of those moments and the momentum and all of those things and how they work together. Avoid being on phones and computers. That's a difficult one. I think I often find that there's cultural norms as well. When I travel, I find that there are levels of appropriateness for people on computers or phones. It can be as simple as saying there are no phones and computers in your event, and if you make a quiet space available for people, then you can direct them to say, we've set up a private phone room. We understand that you're all busy people and you might need to take calls. Here's the phone room, and you can do that. Computers, I find a lot of people take notes on their computers these days. I personally don't, and I do actually ask people to turn their computers off in workshops, because I find that there is a temptation there to just check your emails at the same times. But I think it's also around creating the right tone of your event, the right energy to your event, and ensuring that those narratives flow through and the momentum and the pacing occurs as well, which we're going to move on to. So we can have a look at that as well. Formats other than the usual panels, which was another question. Lots of questions in your question. There's lots of different ways. I think there's probably some information on think tanks around different channels. Other than the usual panels, I think there's lots of different creative ways that you can trial within an event, whether they're round circles or you can use workshop style. You can use voting formats. You can use pre-questions. You can sort of ask an audience. You can wander around and think of your big 200 people events still like workshops in many ways, or use techniques from workshops that you can appropriate in a manner. But there's also other ways in the environment that you can have people engage with your dialogue and with your messaging. So with your messaging and the information you're considering, there will be different levels of your information that you want to convey. So that might be some data visualization. That might be a story that you tell along the wall in graphics. It might be a video that you use up front. So I think interspersing your event with different formats, rather than someone standing out the front with a PowerPoint all day and talking at you, is the way to create interesting and engaging events as well. Yes, and the topics discussed, making sure they're relevant and understanding why people would come to your event, and making sure that you are going to talk about relevant topics to them from their perspective and what their needs are, rather than as some academic type events have occurred. It's not about just them presenting their project and their successes. Making sure that you talk through with your speakers around what they might say, what their different points of view are on your argument that you've clearly articulated up front, and talking through them prior to the event, to making sure that it's all going to cohesively flow or show different layers to the same argument. Okay, we're going to move on. Thank you for that question, and certainly we can talk about that more in the email. Okay, so experience mapping. This is one of the tools that I mentioned that that can be used in a light touch, or in some instances can be used at a much deeper level. We're going to look at it from a purely awareness perspective today, because actually I run workshops that are full day types of situations on doing one of these. However, I believe that you will get enough out of this to understand this and use this in a basic way, and then you can continue to learn more about this. So an experience map is a way of visualizing and capturing and presenting your key insights in your interaction between your organization and your audience. And it's for a better word, it's a process map with some added sprinkles on top. At its heart, it's a journey model, and it's a journey model of that particular audience member with your archetypal journey that you've created from an aggregate of all of your audience requirements in your personas. So essentially, it's a journey of one of your audience members going from A to B, as in they attempt to satisfy a need. So if one of your stakeholders groups is a policy group, and they're coming to your event to understand your key recommendations on a particular policy across an event journey, what are all the steps in their journey that they're going to take? And I will explain this further with some imagery, don't worry. So its value is it creates new insights. What I do find, and I just experienced this today in a workshop, was without it, I don't think you have consensus around what the experience will be. And I will talk about that further. It uncovers barriers and opportunities. Without stepping through, like you did the toast exercise, without stepping through all of those activities, often you miss things or you assume things. And so stepping each of those things through in regards to the sequence and the timing of how they occur means that you can understand what things might be an issue and where the opportunities are. So it might be that you realize that they need to have a report before you get to the event, that you need to have a particular type of visual communication on a screen, or lots of different things. And then it can be an artifact as used as a tool to make improvements. And now I'm talking more broadly at this point, but it can be very useful in events to consider what your ideal process might be to inform your planning. So let's, just before we move on to showing you some of these, just quickly on terms. So channel that we talk about in think tank communications, for those who are not familiar with the term, is a medium for interacting with your audience. But a touch point, which us designers use, is a point of interaction between you and your audience. Now, in the event experience, there are multiple touch points along your journey. So if you think back to your 5 E's, when they receive an email, that's a touch point. That is a moment that they interact with you, form opinions, gain information, gain value, and have some sort of exchange between you and your organization. And if you think about when you turn up at the venue and how you're greeted, and all of those things are moments. A great example, I think, outside of this context is when you consider a service that you're experiencing. So if you go into a store and you purchase an item, and then and that was a great experience. So you've gone through all those steps. You went to the store, you went in the store, you found what you needed, the service at the desk was great, etc., etc. You get home and you find that there's something wrong with it, and you ring the customer service. And the customer service line on the phone, it doesn't represent the same quality and doesn't answer your needs. So considering all of those touch points from end to end, and do they represent who you are as an organization? Do they deliver quality and consistency? So those 2 terms I use, and I just wanted to clarify those for you before we move on. So what makes up an experience map? And I've simplified this, but there is a lens. So whose experience is it? Is it your policymakers? Is it your young think tankers? Is it funders? Whose view of the experience are we talking about? Then we will, as a process, you will uncover insights. So you think about what their needs are, what their behaviors might be, what their desires are, as in our persona. Then you will chart the moments. So you will think about all of those moments that will occur within your event, post-event, pre-event, as a single timeline, essentially. You will make sure that it tells a story. So just creating a process map as such is not an experience map. An experience map talks to the needs, the emotions of a person and what they experience at any given point. Now, this can be useful in your think tank if you're thinking about services you provide to various stakeholders as well. So thinking about what will occur at any of those given points. And I can't see the rest of the screen. There we go. And then you actually use the artifact. So lots of people make these lovely maps and don't use them to then either plan for something or to take strategic action or to assess a situation. So yes, it's about the process and the activity, which can be very insightful and very useful to you, but also what are you going to do with it? So what? So being able to sort of sequence your person's experience across time and space. And then, of course, you can iterate it and change it depending on your insights that occur, and you can distribute it amongst your team to consider it for other things that might be useful across your organization, because you've understood who are the key people that you're speaking to within your organization more broadly. So how to make an experience map? Now, there's lots of tools available to do that, and I will send you some. I think there are 4 basic things that you can use. And what I wanted to say is it doesn't need to be overly pretty, as you saw with your toast situation. What I usually do is, get a piece of paper or get some, big paper and map it out with some Post-it notes or make some marks on a paper. So basically the structure for your experience map is, and let's use the new think tankers at a conference. So what are the actions they will take? So the sequencing of actions. So they will receive an invite, or they will see the Twitter invite. They will sign up. They will pay their money. They will make their way to the event via the information you've provided them on how to get there. They will turn up at the event. They will be greeted by a particular person. They will sign up. They will get a name badge. They will enter. There will coffee provided. There may be time for talking. They will go through the first panel. There will be a break. So all of the things that you do, they might be then interested in seeing some of the data visualization that you have in the breakout rooms. So think about all the actions that they will take across your experience. Well, what are the emotions that they will have at any given point? And I think some of that is a bit of a guesswork. So it can inform your decision making. So if you know that there's going to be a lot of energy in the room, what will you do to craft that moment to enhance that? Or if you know there's going to be some political situations within your debate, what will those people's emotions be at that point? Are they going to be concerned about their own reputation, or are they going to be protective, or are they going to be fearful? So you can make some guesses from this. And then questions and needs. So things like they are on their way to the event would spark a question or a need from them. How am I going to get there? What's the best way to get there? Now, if you've laid out in your invitation various ways and you've provided a handy map, then you've answered that need on that experience map. So being able to articulate this and map this out in quite a micro level detail means that you can find needs that can enhance the experience. And although that's a fairly banal example, what you'll find when you're doing either larger services to your stakeholders, or you're doing larger conferences, you can actually find that there are some opportunities that you can tap into to spark action afterwards, or create really great conversations, etc. And channels. So basically the method in which they will interact, email, phone, in your venue, face-to-face, those types of things. So it's not just about considering one channel or one way of communicating. You are charting the journey of the need across the end-to-end experience. So I've got some examples here. I'm not saying any of these are right or wrong. They're just different examples. But what you can see up the top, see it says before, during, and after. Now, I would suggest to you to use the 5 E's across there as a phase, as a prompt for your map. So if you write the 5 E's across the top, then it allows you to consider the end-to-end journey. So what are the actions? And then you can see these guys have used Post-it notes. What are the actions they will do? What will they be thinking at this point? For example, how will I get there? What will they be feeling? Excited, nervous, protective, fearful, angry, whatever it might be. And there's a full gamut of emotions in think tank experiences, more than others, I suspect. What are the touch points? So this is very useful to understand how all of your communication methods link up together, and how will they be consistent? How will they represent your brand? Like I suggested in the service design aspect, is if you have a great in-store experience, but then you pick up the phone and that's terrible, then that will impact your view of that brand. And therefore the same applies here, is if they're not consistent and you have a poor experience at one of these situations, then that might impact their ability to interact, or their desire to interact. And then, of course, that has knock-on consequences related to your outcomes that you articulated in the beginning. If you've not created a situation where people don't feel comfortable to debate, then, of course, that has knock-on effects. And then you can talk about opportunities for improvement as well. And I show this to you because whilst these are tools that are often used for a much more complex situations, at a very basic level, I think these are really useful ways to plan out your event and consider your event. And even in a workshop environment, it's useful. Now I've got some people talking. Can we zoom in on the feelings I'm really curious how that works. Probably not, because I might lose you, but I will send you some examples as well. It's yeah. So as I said, this is a tool that can be used in quite complex situations. And so in your user research that you would undertake, your qualitative research in a as-is state using this, then you would use that research to inform the emotions. For example, I'm upset that when I called the helpline, they didn't respond. And you know that because of your survey results. So that's how all that sort of research waterfalls into things like this. However, in a future state perspective, there's a little bit of intuition, there's a little bit of data, and there's a little bit of guesswork at the same time. I think it broadly, if you do it collaboratively, I think you get quite close to an understanding in this example. But again, there are different ways in which, or different levels in which you can use this tool. Thank you for the question. Here's another example. You can see very quickly the actions undertaken, the phases across your timeline. You can see the timeline down the bottom. There might be some expression around how they might be feeling. Are they concerned? Are they happy? Are they worried? Here's another one that's slightly more complicated. This might be also similar, is visiting a museum or gallery. So all the things in which the touch points, as you see on the left, the phases along the bottom, similar to the 5 E's that we had used. And you don't have to use the 5 E's. You can use other prompts. It's just something it's quick and useful to consider the end-to-end. And so then you can see how they interact across their journey in different ways, what they might need, what are the tools they might need, what technology they might interact with, or what people they might interact with across that. So that's another example. And sort of in the corporate world, I guess, this is what an experience map more likely would look like in a service design perspective. As you can see, there's a lot of information on there. You'll see the persona down the side, some of their key things that they might say, or some takeaways from the research you've undertaken, the different perceptions they've had, but some information that you might have gathered through research. But standing back from this, you will still find that the architecture of this is still the same. So I wanted to, again, stop there before we move on to the second last thing. If there's any questions, otherwise I will show you a draft event canvas, which I am sort of crafting at the moment. So this is a dummy one. I do have an actual one that is designed. It has prompt questions within it. So this is your event in a page, and I will send you the real one rather than this dummy one for the presentation purposes. And it's basically your event on a page, and it's a bunch of prompts to think about your event from an end-to-end experience. And then of course you would use those other tools that I suggested. So this wraps up a lot of what we've been talking about. So, you know, what is your theme? And we've spoken that that's not enough. So what's your top line messaging? What's your summary argument? This is from the left-hand side. What are the 3 key takeaways that you want them to know? What's the strategic intent? Whether it might be from a policy area and from an organizational sort of area as well. So you can outline those. What's the purpose of this specific event? And what are the objectives in that? Who are the audience personas? So you would have understood some of this already, or you might have undertaken this, or this will prompt you to go do that. What are their needs? Are you sure of all of the different needs, and how will you answer those, or how will you prioritize those? It's not to say that you will answer everyone's needs, but there will be some prioritization. And when you have this in a canvas, you can start to sort of play things off each other. To someone else's question, what are the other stakeholders, and what do we need to consider for them? So whether you have some special guests that you really need to look after, or some special speakers, or some particular funding partners in the room, what do they need? What do they need, as well as your audience members? Event format, what's the style of format? And then you can start to cross-check that. Is this format going to suit this audience, and will this deliver my strategic sort of objectives for this event and the purpose of this event? What will happen? So just a very quick outline so that you can use this to circulate and communicate. You can start to think more broadly at a top level view, what you want people to think, feel, know, and do, like we spoke in the empathy map. Maybe at a bit more of a broader level, you can just very quickly articulate. So do might be, we want people to sign up to the next event, or we want people to use our recommendations in their next policy, making workshop, or whatever it might be. What do you want them to think, and do you want them to come away feeling like you are the leading expert in this particular topic? So at a top line level, you can start to articulate that. So who are the speakers, and what are the speakers' different points of view? So Kike said in his article that he has online, which he can now put a link to, thank you. What are the different speakers' point of view? So if you've summarized your argument and you have the different speakers, how will those all connect to each other? Or how will they challenge each other and have different points of view on that same argument? So I think articulating this up front, even if it's having a conversation with them before, what is their main argument that they're going to bring to it, or their perspective? And writing a single line around that is very useful in the sort of broader picture. And the last one that I have there, I can't read because of the key influences. So, that's right. Key influences would be, are there any particular special people that you need to invite or attract are paramount to achieving some of these objectives that you have? So if you don't have particular people in the room, will you get the right debate? Or will you get the media impressions if you don't have a particular person there? So just thinking about that a little bit further is what I meant by that. So that, I think, is a really useful, just in a one page, to give you some sort of prompts around thinking about your event, and of course utilizing those tools that I've just mentioned, all in some sort of sequence. So the last slide I will leave you with is a few pitfalls and principles that I've outlined. So speaker-centered versus audience-centered. And indeed, Kiko mentioned argument-centered, which I really like. We've spoken about that and what that means. So making sure that you consider that. And that has different factors to consider, such as Kiko mentioned, protocol up front can create a boring and poor opening enter experience. However, and it talks to the speakers and making them feel welcome and special, which is nice. However, that's not very audience-centered, because you're wasting their time potentially, and therefore you can just cut down to a basic introduction, or you could send out their bios beforehand if that's appropriate. Big names versus good public speakers. If there's a big name there, but they don't deliver a message very well, is that very audience-centered? No. So considering their needs and your needs and the balance there as well. Open versus closed experiences. So there are different type of events that we've spoken about, and there'll be different ways in which you invite people, whether it's a round table or a panel or a public event. I think one thing that I got from the conference was the triangulation between policymakers, think tanks, and the public. And I would challenge you to consider that in your open or closed experience, event experience design. Question. Oh, no, I've lost it. Sorry, I lost that question. Open and closed experiences also means being authentic and being accessible, and also not necessarily presenting just at your project end, but consider presenting midway and having a retrospective of your learnings, what worked and what didn't in a midpoint. I know people are very protective of that, but I suspect that that's not very useful to some situations, not all, but some situations. And you can use that to test ideas. So that's what I mean also by being open and closed. Cohesive. So we spoke about visuals and narrative. A pitfall is having really poor slides, or only presenting in slides, or having them all mismatched, not having a thread of a narrative throughout your event, and a consistency with the speakers in some way. And also a cohesiveness in how you represent your brand as well. And I again use that term loosely, but how you represent your organization and what you stand for as an organization. What's the personality of your organization? What do you hold? What are you known for, and what do you value? Going rogue. Keynotes and facilitators, we've all had those horrible situations where the keynote goes off on a completely different tangent and the facilitator feels that they can't stop them. I think honesty usually works in that situation, but I think good communication before the event, and back to that canvas, is having those conversations with all your speakers around their point of view and how it ties into an argument, and being argument-centered around that means that hopefully you can mitigate some of these rogue presenters, and having a great facilitator that is comfortable with some of the context around what you're going to be talking about. Value knowledge exchange. So how will you create those moments for conversation, for dialogue, for testing ideas, and not just being a broadcast event, but opening it for debate. And so using those different styles of events, but also using mechanisms for people to interact in different ways. It could be as simple as having some posters on the wall with different questions and people voting with spots, or voting or putting their response on it, and collating those and using those at a point to say, we asked you these questions in the break, and synthesize it. This is what we've heard about X. What do people think? Let's now use that in our panel debate, or what have you. So really value a knowledge exchange and how you support knowledge exchange and dialogue. Some of those principles are there. So it's strategic and outcomes focused, making sure that you understand why you're having the event, how it plays into your organizational strategy, what the purpose of it is, and is it the right channel for what you want to achieve. Audience-centered, we've discussed. Convene systems, bring together lots of different people from different perspectives, and be seen to be that person that is the network convener in that space can be really useful. And authentic, being open and true to your organizational values and perspective and personality, whether that might be a formal situation or a relaxed situation, or whatever it might be, trying to be authentic as possible. Making sure that it's an end-to-end journey, as we've discussed, right through from pre-event, entering the event, during, post, and what will happen between that event and the next event. Don't let that gap occur and go dead. Consider what happens in that. And making sure, as we've just said, embody your brand values and your brand personality, and let that shine through, because that's when you have engaged people who are interested and inspired and empowered, and it shows that you also value their time and their effort in attending. So that wraps up There's a few minutes further if anyone wants to make any further comments or questions. We will send out some further information in an email and a summary. I will put some links to some different tools that might be useful. What I also wanted to highlight was that together with Think Tanks, we are holding a 2-day workshop that deep dives into the employee experience, the think tank employee experience, and what are the barriers or what are the situation or the positives and negatives in how you address the employee experience. And we will dive into some of the sort of organizational principles of that, the behaviors, and then apply a much more deeper design approach to how you will address different types of employee needs within your organization. So the link's there. You can read about it in a far more articulate way than I just did on that link. So do feel free to sign up to that. And I really look forward to meeting some of you there in person. And I know that Ava on Think Tanks will send you a short survey if you would like to participate. If you would like to also, we have an option to participate in a further activity that you would have seen on the invitation. And that means if you would like, we will be sending out an activity for those people who sign up to design their own event using some of these tools. And what you will receive from me is not only the activity itself and the instructions and some tools for that, but you will also receive some feedback and critique and assistance from me in that. And I believe Think Tanks are providing a certificate for that as well. So do have a look at that on your invitation if you're interested in furthering your learning through that space. I'm going to just look at the chats. Okay, so we've got a few things there. Some of these are really interesting, questions. I will try to answer some of those in the emails. I like the audience high is exhausting. I think that's very good. Okay, any sort of last questions before we sort of end? If you have any further questions, then do feel free to ask. But thank you so much for coming. I hope that was useful. And I hope to meet you again in person at some point. Thank you so much. Bye.